Chapter One, Exploring Global Issues by Michael T. Snarr. Record-setting numbers of refugees, brutal beheadings by terrorists, abject poverty, the growing crisis of climate change, cruel human rights abuses, and widespread malnutrition and diseases. If you monitor the news, these are the headlines you'll see. Unfortunately, as the statistics immediately below reveal, various global issues are threatening humanity. Approximately 200,000 people are added to the world's total population every day. Nearly 16,000 children die each day from hunger-related causes, one child every 5 seconds. There are 795 million hungry people in the world today. The world has more refugees now than at any time since 1945. Approximately 1 in 9 people are undernourished globally. Since 1990, global CO2 emissions have increased 50%. Approximately 1 in 3 people, 2.4 billion, lack access to flush toilets or other forms of proper sanitation. Of the warmest 15 years, 13 have occurred since 2000. Scientists estimate that over the next several decades, 75% of animal species will become extinct. Nearly 40% of adults are overweight, and 13% are obese. An area the size of South Africa, or twice the size of Texas, has been deforested over the past 25 years. Though the news headlines today are often negative and the problems of the world often seem overwhelming, progress is being made on many global issues. Important strides have been made in the areas of education, war, health, and more. And through the hard work of states, international governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, and individuals, more improvements can be made. The list below offers some reasons for hope. War between countries has become very rare. The rate of global deforestation has been slowing. The global literacy rate has increased from 83% to 91% since 1990. On average, global life expectancies today are more than twice as high as they were a century ago. Over the past decade and a half, new HIV infections have dropped almost 3.5 million cases to 2.1 million. In the poorer countries, the percentage of hungry people decreased from 23.3% to 12.9% since 1990, and the number of deaths of children under age 5 have declined by 53%. The number of people consuming improved drinking water has increased to 91% from 76% since 1990. For the first time ever, the percentage of the world's population living in extreme poverty is less than 10%. Each of these items is related to a global issue discussed in this book, and many of them affect the reader. But what is a global issue? The term is used here to refer to 2 types of phenomena. First, there are those issues that are transnational, that is, they cross political boundaries, country borders. These issues affect individuals in more than one country. A clear example is air pollution produced by a factory in the United States and blown into Canada. Second, there are problems and issues that do not necessarily cross borders, but affect a large number of individuals throughout the world. Ethnic rivalries and human rights violations, for example, may occur within a single country, but have a far wider impact. For the contributors to this volume, the primary goal is to introduce several of the most pressing global concerns and demonstrate how strongly they are interconnected. Since these issues affect each and every one of us, we also hope to motivate the reader to learn more about them. Is the world shrinking? There has been a great deal of discussion in recent years about globalization, which can be defined as the intensification of economic, political, social, and cultural relations across borders. Evidence of globalization is seen regularly in our daily lives. In the United States, grocery stores and shops at the local mall are stocked with items produced abroad. Likewise, hats and t-shirts adorned with the logos of Nike, Adidas, and the New York Yankees, for example, are easily found outside the United States. In many countries, Taylor Swift, Rihanna, and other U.S. music groups often dominate the radio waves. The BBC and CNN dominate television screens, and the Avengers and other Hollywood films dominate the theaters. Are we moving toward a single global culture? In the words of Benjamin Barber, we are being influenced by, quote, the onrush of economic and ecological forces that demand integration and uniformity and that memorize the world with fast music, fast computers, and fast food. With MTV, Macintosh, and McDonald's, pressing nations into one commercial homogeneous global network, one McWorld, tied together by technology, ecology, communication, and commerce, unquote. For the editors of this book, globalization took on a more personal face several years ago when we took a group of students to Mexico. As we sat on the bus, bound for the pyramids of Teotihuacan, just outside Mexico City, we met a Canadian named Jag. We learned on the bus ride that Jag was a Hindu from India who lived in Montreal. His job was to assist newly formed Inuit or Eskimo government and Nunavut, a new Canadian territory created through negotiations with the Canadian government. Think about it. A Hindu Indian living in French-speaking Montreal, assisting the Inuit government, and visiting a period built by the Teotihuacan peoples while vacationing in Mexico City. Now that's globalization. Technology is perhaps the most visible aspect of globalization, and in many ways is the driving force. Communications technology has revolutionized our information systems. CNN reaches hundreds of millions of households in over 200 countries and territories throughout the world. Quote, computer, television, cable, satellite, laser, fiber optic, and microchip technologies, along with nano and cyber technology, are combining to create a vast interactive communications and information network that can potentially give every person on Earth access to every other person and make every datum, every byte available to every set of eyes, unquote. Technology also has aided the increase of international trade and international capital flows and has enhanced the spread of Western, primarily U.S., culture. Thomas Friedman, in his boldly titled bestseller, The World is Flat, argued that the world is undergoing its third phase of globalization. Quote, globalization 3.0 is shrinking the world from a size small to a size tiny and flattening the playing field at the same time, unquote. Whereas globalization in the past was characterized by companies becoming more global, this third phase is unique due to, quote, the newfound power for individuals to collaborate and compete globally, unquote. For instance, radiologists in India and Australia interpret CAT scan images from the United States. Telephone operators in India answer calls from major U.S. corporations, and the Japanese speakers at call centers in China serve Japanese customers. Thus, the playing field is being leveled, and individuals and small companies from all over the world, including poor countries, can now compete in the global economy. We can see a similar phenomenon occurring with global conflict. Steven Pinker and Andres Mack have discovered that while the media may lead us to believe the world is increasingly violent, we are actually living in a relatively peaceful time. Similarly, Joshua Goldstein has noted that over the recent decades, wars have been diminishing in number, and war deaths have been decreasing. Goldstein argues that governments, by participating in an international community, jointly achieve some mutually beneficial outcomes that could not be realized separately. The reduction of war worldwide is one of those outcomes, unquote. In part, Goldstein recognizes the importance of shared global values that widely reject war and human rights abuses. Both the strengthening of the international community and shared values are evidence of a shrinking, increasingly homogeneous world. Of course, Earth is not literally shrinking nor flat, but in light of the rate at which travel and communication speeds have increased, the world has, in a sense, become smaller. Most scholars assert that we are living in a qualitatively different time in which humans are interconnected more than ever before. Quote, there is a distinction between the contemporary experiences of change and that of earlier generations. Never before has change come so rapidly on such a global scale and with such global visibility, unquote. Or as Friedman puts it, quote, there is something about the flattening of the world that is going to be qualitatively different from other such profound changes. The speed and breadth with which is taking hold, this flattening process is happening at warp speed and directly or indirectly touching a lot more people on the planet at once, unquote. This seemingly uncritical acceptance of the concept of globalization and a shrinking world is not without its critics, who point out that labor, trade, and capital moved at least as freely, if not more so, during the second half of the 19th century as they do now. Take, for example, the following quote, which focuses on the dramatic changes that have taken place in the past 3 decades to make the world more economically interdependent. Quote, the complexity of modern finance makes New York dependent on London, London dependent on Paris, Paris upon Berlin, to a greater degree than has ever yet been the case in history. This interdependence is a result of the daily use of those contrivances of civilization, the instantaneous dissemination of financial and commercial information, and generally the incredible increase in the rapidity of communication, unquote. If this statement were to appear in a newspaper today, no one would give it a second thought. But it was written at the start of the 20th century, illustrating the belief of some critics that globalization is not a new phenomenon. Some skeptics caution that while interdependence and technological advancement has increased in some parts of the world, this is not true for the vast majority of third world countries. The term third world, the South, developing world, and less developed countries are used interchangeably throughout this book in reference to the poor countries, in contrast to first world, the North, developed world, and more developed countries, in reference to the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. For example, Hamid Maulana argues that global is not universal. Although a small number of people in third world countries may have access to much of the new technology and truly live in the quote-unquote global village, the large majority of population in the South do not. Research on global internet usage illustrates this point. Table 1.1, see text, shows findings from a survey of geographic regions of the world. Utilizing internet usage as an indicator of globalization, the table clearly shows large disparities among regions. Notice that in Europe, 73.5%, North America, 87.9%, and Oceania, Australia, 72.9%, a majority of the population uses internet. However, Africa, 27%, and Asia, 38.8%, stand in stark contrast. North Americans are over twice as likely to use the internet as are Asians, and over 3 times more likely than Africans. These trends over the past decade indicate that Asia, the Middle East, and specifically Africa are rapidly increasing their internet usage, nearly 7,000% in 15 years. However, the gap between North and South will take many years to close. In other words, globalization is far from universal when measured by internet usage. Similarly, one can argue that the increased flow of information, a characteristic of globalization, goes primarily in one direction. Even those in the South who have access to television or radio are at a disadvantage. The globalization of communication in the less developed countries typically is a one-way proposition. The people do not control any of the information. They only receive it. It is also true that, worldwide, the ability to control or generate broadcasts rests in the hands of a tiny minority. While lack of financial resources is an important impediment to globalization, there are other obstacles. Paradoxically, Benjamin Barber, who argues that we are experiencing globalization integration via McDonaldization, asserts that we are at the same time experiencing global disintegration. He cites the breakup of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, as well as many other ethnic and national identities, see Chapter 4, as evidence of the forces countering globalization. Many subnational groups within nations, desire to govern themselves. Others see threats to the religious values and identity, and therefore reject the secular nature of globalization. As a result, Hamid Maulana argues that globalization, quote, has produced not uniformity, but a yearning for a return to non-secular values. Today, there is a rebirth of revitalized fundamentalism in all the world's major religions, whether Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Shintoism, or Confucianism. At the same time, the global homogeneity has reached the airwaves. These religious tenets have reemerged as defining identities. None of these criticisms mean that our contemporary world is not now different in some important aspects. There is widespread agreement that communications, trade, and capital are moving at unprecedented speed and volume. However, these criticisms do provide an important warning against overstating or making broad generalizations about the process and effects of globalization. Is globalization good or bad? There are some aspects of globalization that most will agree are good, for example, the spread of medical technology, or bad, for example, increased global trade in illegal drugs. The same technology that connects people throughout the world for good causes, such as the transmission of valuable healthcare products and information, also enables groups like ISIS to recruit via social media. Given globalization's complexity, it is useful to try to analyze the concept by considering different types of globalization. Table 1-2, see text, identifies 3 areas that are affected by globalization: political, economic, and cultural, and gives examples of positive and negative aspects of globalization. A key aspect of political globalization is the weakened ability of the state to control both what crosses its borders and what happens inside them. In other words, globalization can reduce the state's sovereignty, its ability to govern matters within its borders. This can be viewed as good because undemocratic governments are finding it increasingly difficult to control the flow of information to and from pro-democracy groups. Satellite television and internet in particular have eroded state sovereignty. But decreased sovereignty also means that the state has difficulty controlling the influx of illegal drugs and unwanted immigrants, including terrorists. In the realm of economics, increased globalization has given consumers more choices. Also, multinational corporations are creating jobs in poor areas where people never before had such opportunities. Some critics reject these points, arguing that increased foreign investment and trade benefit only a small group of wealthy individuals, and that, as a result, the gap between rich and poor grows both within countries and between countries. These critics point out that the combined wealth of the 15 richest people in the world is more than the gross domestic product, the total goods and services produced in a given year, of Sub-Saharan Africa. Related to this is the argument that many well-paying blue-collar jobs are moving from the north to poor countries of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. At the cultural level, those who view increased cultural contact as positive say that it gives people more opportunities to learn about and purchase goods from other countries. But critics of cultural globalization see things differently. Samuel Huntington has argued that the shrinking world will bring a clash of civilizations. In this scenario, clashes will occur among many civilizations, including the largely Christian West against Islam. Other critics are concerned with cultural imperialism, in which dominant groups, primarily wealthy countries, force their culture on others. A primary tool of cultural influence in the North's multi-billion-dollar advertising budgets used to influence, a primary tool of cultural influence is the North's multi-billion-dollar advertising budgets used to influence and to some extent destroy non-Western cultures. The fear of cultural imperialism is certainly a key component in the animosity of some Arabs toward the United States. Other critics are increasingly fearful, and more national and minority languages are more and more fearful that more and more national and minority languages will become extinct as foreign languages, especially English. As foreign languages, especially English, penetrate borders. In response to cultural influences, countries like Iran have banned Western music from government radio and television stations in an attempt to stop unwanted outside influences. Even Western countries like France have adopted policies to regulate unwanted foreign cultural influences. The degree to which cultural values can be quote-unquote exported is the subject of some debate. Huntington argues that, quote, drinking Coca-Cola does not make Russians think like Americans, any more than eating sushi makes Americans think like Japanese. Throughout human history, fads and material goods have spread from one society to another without significantly altering the basic culture of the recipient society, unquote. Similarly, others such as Hamid Maulana argue that globalization brings only superficial change. Quote, McDonald's may be in nearly every country, but in Japan, sushi is served alongside hamburgers. In many countries, hamburgers are not even on the menu. Thus, unquote. Thus, the global product is often altered to take on a local flavor. The term, quote-unquote, glocalization has combined the words global and local to describe such hybrid products. In sum, globalization offers a multitude of advantages to people throughout the world, from greater wealth to more choices in consumer products. At the same time, globalization exposes people to greater vulnerability and insecurity. Our jobs become less secure, diseases travel faster, and traditional family structures are weakened. It is left to the reader to determine whether globalization is having a positive or negative effect on the issues discussed in this book. Is globalization enhancing human capacity to deal with a particular problem? or is it making it more difficult? Of course, each individual's perspective will be influenced by whether he or she evaluates these issues based on self-interest, national interest, a religious view, or a global humanitarian viewpoint. Readers must decide, based on what is most important to them, how to evaluate moral questions of good versus bad. For example, when considering the issue of trade, Chapter 10, those concerned first and foremost with self-interest will ask, how does free trade affect me? For national readers, the question will be, how does free trade affect my country? For religious readers, the question will be, how does my religion instruct me on this issue? Finally, global humanitarians will ask, what is best for humanity in general? Interconnectedness among issues. As mentioned earlier, a primary purpose of this book is to explore the interconnectedness of the various issues discussed here. For example, the chapter on poverty should not be considered separately from the chapter on population, even though the two issues are treated separately. Here are several examples of how issues discussed in this book are interconnected. The growth in the world's population, Chapter 12, has been significantly affected, especially in Africa, by the AIDS crisis, Chapter 7. Many of the value judgments concerning trade issues, Chapter 10, are intricately linked to human rights issues, Chapter 5. Ethnic conflict, Chapter 4, as well as other types of conflict, often leads to internal migration, as well as international population movements, Chapter 12. One of the recommendations for reducing poverty, Chapter 11, is to educate women and give more decision-making power over their lives, Chapter 13. Climate change, Chapter 15, is expected to have increasingly negative effects on health, Chapter 7, migration, Chapter 12, and conflict, Chapter 2. The interconnectedness of these issues is even more extensive than these examples demonstrate. The recent events surrounding ISIS provide an appropriate case study. In 2014, reports came from Iraq and Syria about a ruthless terror group inspired by radical Islamic beliefs. This more radicalized offshoot of Al-Qaeda sought to establish an Islamic-based country, or more specifically, a caliphate, in the territory currently in the countries of Iraq and Syria. To some extent, the emergence of ISIS was enabled by the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the civil war in Syria. This civil war pits the leaders of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, against diverse groups of rebels seeking to remove Assad from power. The civil war in Syria and the emergence of ISIS has led many countries to take sides. For instance, Iran and Russia support the Assad regime, while the United States and several Middle Eastern countries have offered varying degrees of support to rebels seeking to oust Assad. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of refugees are flooding out of the region and seeking safe harbor in North Africa, Europe, North America, and elsewhere. In addition, millions of people are displaced within Iraq and Syria. It is believed that there are currently more refugees in the world than at any time since World War II. These refugees are subject to a host of related issues. Many have been relegated to refugee camps consisting of thousands of makeshift tents. Unfortunately, these camps often do not have adequate sanitation or access to clean water. Health officials point out that crowded conditions can lead to the health problems of diseases like measles, typhoid, cholera, and polio. Quote, high numbers of unvaccinated, malnourished people combined with unsanitary living conditions makes outbreaks among refugee camps very likely. Unfortunately, governments and people of many of the host countries are reluctant or even vehemently opposed to allowing Middle Eastern refugees into their countries. The issues range from financial issues within their host country to the fear that ISIS fighters may pose as refugees to outright anti-Islamic feelings. Some might pose as refugees to outright anti-Islamic feelings. Some European nations have been accused of human rights violations against Middle Eastern refugees. For instance, the United States has accused the Czech Republic of human rights violations against migrants and refugees in an effort to dissuade them from entering the country. This brief description of the catastrophic events surrounding the Syrian civil war and the emergence of ISIS reveals a network of interconnected events that, for the purposes of this book, are described in different chapters. Chapter 2, which discusses threats to global security, the changing nature of war from interstate between world countries to intrastate or within countries. It is a natural home for cases like this one. Yet, the nature of this issue extends beyond a single chapter. Chapter 12 addresses the issue of migration and refugees, while issues of poverty, Chapter 11, health, Chapter 7, and human rights, Chapter 5, are each discussed in separate chapters. Chapter 4 delves into how nationalism can pit one group against another, seen in the anti-immigrant sentiment just mentioned. Less visible in the Syrian civil war case is the connection to environment. Yet, some observers argue that not only can we expect to see future increases in refugees due to climate change and extreme weather, see chapters 6 and 15, but even argue that climate change is a contributing factor to the current refugee crisis. Globalization, discussed in all chapters of this book, displays a significant role in many aspects of this case. For instance, globalization facilitates transportation and rescue attempts of refugees, as well as the communications ability of virtually all parties involved in the refugee situation. As mentioned earlier, increased communications speed due to globalization can be used for good and evil purposes. On the one hand, ISIS has been able to recruit fighters abroad more effectively through its savvy use of social media. But in a harmonious twist, hackers have used the same technology to ridicule ISIS by replacing its website with an advertisement for Viagra, the sex-enhancing drug. In sum, readers should remember that even though the issues in this book are treated in separate chapters, many of them are inexorably linked. Key players. Of the key players or actions involved in these global issues, the most salient are countries. In the following pages, you will continually read about the countries of the world and their efforts to solve these various issues. Often, countries get together in the form of international government organization, IGOs. The logic is that by cooperating through an IGO like the United Nations, the World Bank, or the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, countries are better equipped to achieve a common goal, like preventing war or alleviating poverty, that they could not accomplish on their own. Goldstein argues that the UN's peacekeeping efforts have been a central factor in reducing war over the past few decades. The reader will notice that IGOs, especially the United Nations and its new Millennium Development Goals, are also mentioned throughout the book. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, working on global issues are part of what is called civil society. For instance, in recent decades, there has been a dramatic increase in the number of NGOs seeking to make the world a better place. NGOs are sometimes referred to as international government organizations, INGOs. NGOs, as their name implies, work outside the government and compose individual citizens working together on one or more problems. There are many well-known NGOs working on global issues: the Red Cross, Greenpeace, Amnesty International, World Vision, and Doctors Without Borders, are just a few of the thousands that exist. Because these NGOs are often made up of highly motivated people in the middle of a war or refugee camp, they can often achieve results that countries cannot. NGOs have become extremely active on all the issues discussed in the book, and they often cooperate with IGOs and individual countries. Other non-governmental actors include businesses, often referred to as transnational corporations or TNCs. Nike, Apple, Toyota, and many other TNCs have gained increasing power in recent years to affect global issues. Many critics complain that due to their economic strength and global networks, TNCs exercise too much power. Celebrities can also play a role in solving global issues discussed in this book. A high-profile example was from the 2015 Global Citizens Festival, which featured celebrities such as Beyoncé, Ed Sheeran, Pearl Jam, and Coldplay. The festival sought to raise money for several issues discussed in this book, including women's rights, hunger, and sustainable development. It is interesting to note that these celebrities partnered with some of the international organizations mentioned here. For example, some of the well-known NGOs that partnered with the festival were CARE, Kiva, Heifer International, the Hunger Project, Oxfam, and UNICEF. IGOs such as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the World Bank also supported the event. Transnational corporations such as Google and YouTube provided financial sponsorship. Finally, individuals can have an impact on global issues as well. Layman Gbowee provides an excellent example. Born in Liberia, Gbowee had a relatively unremarkable early life. However, as a teenager, she experienced the first Liberian Civil War, and the war drew to a close. As the war drew to a close, she took part in a trauma healing seminar sponsored by UNICEF. She later became a peace activist and led Muslim and Christian women in nonviolent anti-war demonstrations. The protests gathered women in markets to pray and sing. She was also part of other creative nonviolent actions. For instance, in 2003, Gbowee and the other women made their way into the hotel where Liberian leaders were holding peace talks. When the delegates tried to leave, the demonstrators blocked their exit and threatened to remove their own clothes. Since seeing an older or married woman naked is a great curse in their culture, the men remained in the hotel and continued negotiating. Based on the other actions for peace in Liberia, Gbowee was a co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. Similarly, Malala Yousafzai, a Pakistani teenager, has raised attention and support for the rights of girls to receive an education. Her outspoken support of the human rights cause led a gunman from the Taliban to shoot Malala in the face. After many months of recovery, Malala continued her fight for the rights of girls and built an international movement. In 2014, at the age of 17, Malala became the youngest person ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Several more examples of individuals like Gbowee and Malala working to resolve various global issues can be found in the following chapters. Outline of the book. The book is organized into 3 parts. Part 1 focuses on various dimensions of conflict and security. It considers some of the primary sources of conflict, such as weapons of mass destruction, nationalism, terrorism, and human rights abuses, as well as conflict over food security, health, and natural resources. The rationale for a broad view of quote-unquote global security is laid out in Chapter 2. Part 2 takes a broad view of global political economy by looking by including economic issues as well as social and environmental concerns. The content includes chapters on international capital flows, international trade, poverty, population, and migration, the role of women in development, sustainable development, and climate change. Part 3 discusses possible future world orders such as hope, sources of hope, challenges in the coming decades, and innovative actions that are being taken to make positive impact on global issues.